Hello, and welcome to the Analysys Mason podcast. My name is Christopher Baugh. I am a partner at Analysys Mason and head of our space research practice at the company. Today, I'm joined by two speakers on our podcast. We're delighted to have two, actually. My two speakers today are Dallas Kasaboski, principal analyst at Analysys Mason, and actually head of our space infrastructure and Earth observation programs. Welcome, Dallas.
Hi, Chris.
Hi there. And we're delighted to have Craig Brown, who is the Director of Investment at the UK Space Agency. Welcome, Craig. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi both.
Thank you both. So we're going to cover a big topic today, which is pretty much the lifeblood of the space industry, which is government support. Now, government support can mean many things. It could mean investment, it could mean regulation, it could mean policy, it could mean quite a bit. But we're covering it from a industry perspective, from Dallas and his viewpoints, and also from the agency perspective. And Craig, who actually, the UK Space Agency being one of the most innovative leaders in supporting governmental support for space. So we're going to cover it from industry and then actual implementation in a domestic market. So Craig, I want to come to you first. And your title is an interesting one, Director of Investment for the UK Space Agency. What does that actually entail on a day-to-day basis?
So a great question to kind of start off on. So I'm the first Director of Investment at the UK Space Agency. So before I took the role didn't exist. It's been part of the agency's transformation, really, to put investment and catalyzing private investment in particular at the heart of our growth agenda. So my portfolio consists of quite a broad range of activities. I'm responsible for innovation, for investment and commercialization. And part of that also covers the telecommunications program, given just how important that part of the space sector is to economic growth. So I've got a bunch of teams sitting under me that deliver a range of different programs, a lot of grant giving, supporting contracts through the European Space Agency, and then also a lot of the soft support that we offer companies and investors to basically get up to speed with what's going on in the space sector, to understand the market, understand what constitutes a good investment versus a poor investment, and then trying to pull all of the levers available to government to make sure that companies can grow in the UK space sector.
Okay, very interesting. So a lot of tangible examples of support. Maybe even taking a step back, how did this all come to be within the UK? If you go back to the beginning, what about space as a market and a sector became so important to the government, essentially, and why this is so important to their objectives?
Well, yeah, it's quite the history lesson, really. When you go back, probably about 15 years now, there was a concerted joint effort between industry, academia, and the bits of government interested in space to properly articulate the value of space to the citizens. There was a big step change in the way in which space was considered by government, by politicians. Back then, it was pre-UK Space Agency creation, so it was back in the day when space was managed across different government departments by a thing called the British National Space Centre. And the way in which that new articulation of space, it sounds very familiar today, where we talk about the value to the citizen and how Earth observation, navigation, telecommunications really add value to the citizen. And not just, it's not just about space exploration and science, as valuable as those things are, but the real tangible benefits to the citizen. And that led to a number of different projects geared towards growing the economy through space and the targeting of different market segments. It really transformed the way in which UK government viewed space as something that underpins modern society, actually, and that's only really increased in time.
Interesting. So making that linkage back to the actual resident, whomever is saying space is important because, and actually making that linkage. That's sort of a forward-looking objective, because we're seeing some of that more and more with space, as we say the word mainstream, but now, a good bit ahead of its time, actually. That's why we have you here today, to kind of give your experience and potentially a roadmap. But government support of space, I often say to those who don't know well, without it, the space industry would not exist. And especially you think of big companies like a SpaceX, without government support, there wouldn't be a SpaceX. There wouldn't be others, of course, down to the startups. So turning to you, Dallas, quickly on the industry side, who is benefiting, who's getting the most benefit out of this type of, so governments, through investments, grants, soft support, the things that Craig had mentioned. Who's getting that support today? Who's benefiting from it, and maybe who needs it the most in today's environment?
Yeah, great context from the both of you. I think the short, brief answer is there are two types of player in the market that's benefiting from government support. Basically, very early stage, and those at kind of a Series B plus level who are looking to deploy something. A lot of this sector is very tech heavy. It's very capital expenditure heavy. It takes a lot of either expertise, financials, partnerships, et cetera, to get off the ground. So the early stage players, government support either gives them any kind of funding that they have, moves them forward a lot more than many other sectors, as well as all the networking and expertise and history that, the governments act as a hub, a central point for either the networking or even accessing certain technologies and things like that. And then the later stage companies, there's a lot of companies right now in this sector that are, maybe they have a name for themselves, but they haven't launched or they haven't deployed. They haven't had that actual flight heritage yet. And they are at a stage where they are ready to try to offer some kind of prototype or some kind of partnership or something that can get them over that gap, get the funding that's needed, get the raise confidence with clients, and have them really enter and be competitive in the sector. So it's a bit of a split between those companies that absolutely need any support and guidance, and those companies that are trying to maintain momentum and enter the market.
Okay, so from your perspective, then this is vital. It's not just a why, but this is critical.
No,
to space
absolutely. I
companies.
mean, you mentioned, without government support, there would be no SpaceX. I mean, first of all, governments are still roughly minimum of 50% of the revenues that are generated in the industry. Depending on pick an industry from manufacturing to services, communications, governments still form a large part of it. But beyond just acting as a pure customer, there is a lot of heritage, expertise, partnerships, things like this that are very difficult for those early stage companies to have or have access to. So whether it's something direct as funding or something slightly indirect, like all the networking hub activity I mentioned, government support is vital. And for those players moving from Series B forward, again, they are often either stuck at a place where they need to kind of get ahead of the curve or demonstrate themselves a little bit so investors can see them, or start landing clients or serving customers. And government support can be very vital there as well to put a stamp essentially on that company and say, we trust this, we recommend this, and that allows that company to move forward.
Okay, so again, back to that vital word being so critical here. But I want to take another layer down. And with Craig, you've been looking at the space industry, been in it for a while, and like everyone, it's changing so rapidly. And investment needs, players, companies, technologies are all changing so rapidly. So as this sector evolves, what are some of the key drivers today that you're focused on, whether it's domestically or even further, is driving this adoption curve? Is it technologies? Is it a segment? What is it that you're seeing in your role as a director of investment?
Yeah, it's easy question to ask, not such an easy one to answer, really. But it's kind of the bread and butter of pretty much everything that my team does, because of course we're here to drive adoption. We consider space to be the hidden utility in the UK. We've done some analysis to look at just how much of the modern economy is underpinned by space in the UK, and it's something like 18% of UK GDP, so a massive proportion of our economy is fundamentally reliant on space services to some degree. So it's quite a responsibility, really, firstly, to maintain that kind of infrastructure, make sure that it's fit for a modern and future economy, but also to make sure that the UK space sector is really well placed to serve the future space economy as it evolves. And boy, is it evolving super, super fast. 10 years ago, nobody was talking about low Earth orbit telecommunication constellations, and now it's the mainstay of the modern space economy. I remember a time when GPS was not a thing, and look at how fundamental it is to the modern economy now to be able to follow that little blue dot on your mobile phone as you traverse a city. So you can see just how much of a relatively short space of time the world has evolved as a result of space and new space services. Even the way in which we consume media has transformed hugely. Partly, part of the challenge for us is the transition away from broadcast media as how we consume our television, even towards something different. Traditionally, broadcast has been a very large proportion of the UK space sector's income, and of course, it still is. But there has been a large transition away from that direct-to-home broadcasting towards other services like internet, and a lot of geospatial technologies coming through, which drive a lot of the service economy and the logistics, for example. So these kind of big changes are happening. When we look at the projects that we get in through our calls for proposals, obviously one of the big kind of buzzwords of the day is AI, but a significant proportion, well over half of the ideas that we get submitted to us by industry in our open calls include some type of AI, be that part of the way in which a company is kind of applying AI into the way in which it generates its kind of service offering, or the way in which it manages its networks, etc. So that's definitely a big theme that we see. I mean, I'm really interested to see how generative AI is going to change the way in which the layperson actually uses space services in the future, where previously you needed some sort of almost technical qualification to be able to use and access space data, space imagery. I'm fairly confident that new algorithms in the AI domain will completely democratize the way in which the general public or different companies access space data and find new ways of using it.
Absolutely. I mean, this is an overwhelming trend with telecom tech in general. But and just a side note, I keep a running list of space use cases in AI, sort of the crossover, and the list is bigger all the time. Very interesting trend. You said two things. You said a hidden utility and 18% of GDP in the UK underpinned by space. That's remarkable, an absolutely remarkable data point. Is the public aware? I mean, I guess it's a very positive data point, frankly. An interesting stat to show.
It's, I guess, the fact that the public isn't aware is why we call it the hidden utility. It's one of those things.
It's inherent, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, it's hidden because so many of what we do on the day to day kind of involves a satellite at some point. I'd also heard somebody once quote that, before we get into the office of a morning, we've probably used a satellite around about 15 times. And I can believe it, when you just look at the way in which news is delivered, or, how we all look at the weather before we leave the house of a morning. All of these things at some point uses a satellite or satellite data. Every time we watch TV, some of the bits that you're watching over the internet have probably found their way from one side of the world to another via a satellite. So all of these things happen. I'm not too sure how absolutely necessary it is for the general public to understand and know that space is as important as it is in the modern society that we live in, but it's definitely important for policymakers to understand, and particularly regulators to understand this, and ultimately treasuries, the bits of government that determine how much money we spend on this stuff. Because it's, it'd be too easy to just assume that space is all about rockets. As important as rockets are, we can't do anything that, in the space sector without them, but they are far from the be all and end all. And they're not the things that necessarily drive the space economy as we know it.
They tended to be the most visible, obviously, but whether it's big Starship launches or others. So the question then, a follow-up for you, Craig, on the support angle that the UK Space Agency provides. And companies are at all different levels of their journey, from early stealth startup the way to more established. And then they're covering lots of different applications and markets. So do you tailor that support? I'm sure it's not a one size fits all, but how do you tailor that support at the different stages of the journey and support them and, prop them up essentially and build their foundation?
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit of a learning curve really for us all, but we also have to evolve the support that we offer with the evolving sector. As I've mentioned earlier, we've been looking at delivering this new space strategy, if you like, over a very long period in the UK, over I'd say 15 years. with various iterations. And of course, in that time, one of the things that government decided to do was to monitor the size and the health of the UK space sector. And we put out a fairly regular report. At the moment, it's annual. For a while, it was every 2 years. But we have some really solid data points as to what the space sector has looked like over a very long period of time. So we can map just how much the space sector has changed, how many businesses we've got in the UK that identify themselves as space companies. And the numbers are quite significant in the way in which they've changed. So even in 2016, when you look at our size and health report, we were probably looking at somewhere in the region of about 700 companies in the UK space sector. And in the most recent, we've got something more like 1,800 companies. So you can see this massive increase in the number of companies in that time. And we also monitor the size of those companies, so how much revenue each of those companies are generating. And back in 2016, I think the number was around about 6 or so companies were responsible for about 80% of the revenues in the UK space sector. So still a very small number of companies responsible for a significant proportion of the revenues, which means that a lot of those companies that identify themselves as space companies are either pre-revenue or low revenue. And it's also true of the economy today, but we've got around about 12 to 14 companies responsible for 80% of the revenues generated in the UK space economy. So we can see that over time, we have scaled a number of companies such that they are contributing significant revenues. But still, the vast majority of companies are in that tail end of that revenue curve. So the next 10% of revenues are made by around about 100 companies within the space sector, with 1,700 companies sitting in the tail of that histogram. That means that we have to tailor the different support that we offer companies if what we really want to do is to supercharge the UK economy through the support that we offer. And one of the things that we are doing as that kind of spectrum of companies has evolved over the last decade or so, we're also evolving the support that we offer to ensure that we're providing the right level of support, the right levers are being pulled to get more and more companies up into the 80% club. I think success for me will be over the next 5-10 years, seeing the number of companies contributing towards that 80% value to be more like 20 or 30 companies rather than a dozen or so companies today.
Okay, but again, your job sounds like you have more to do every day, from 700 to 1,800 domestic companies. That's remarkable growth. So I imagine you're quite a busy person these days with all of that activity.
It sharpens the mind, absolutely, because we have to live within our means. We haven't seen our budgets grow at the level of the economy, certainly the number of companies that we have to support. And so it means that we have to spend our money very wisely and very carefully to make sure that we maximize the return on that investment.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That makes great sense. And I want to now transition to the industry on that note. Industry is a supporter, and I think Dallas may be thinking about providing value when it comes to raising money, which without the money and the grants and funding, it's hard to envision growth. Support, how does that government, generally speaking, I'm thinking globally or you want a specific market, fare when they're providing value and helping the industry raise money for very capital intensive activities usually?
Yeah, I think there's a number of ways that you can look at this question. So raising money is incredibly challenging. I mean, budgets and investors, the investment appetite waxes and wanes, grows and changes with different trends. As I mentioned earlier, sometimes a government can support a company purely by working with them, partnering with them, having any kind of an official exchange between them, anything that can give that company any kind of credibility on the market. And it also, in some ways, governments can act as a kind of like a test bed, both for actual service, but interacting with clients. What I mean by that is that there's a lot of risk. If we're talking about hardware and things like this, it's very intense and it can take years to develop. And most investors are not willing to invest in something before it is really demonstrated, so any progress. So you have this kind of paradox where a company can only move forward if they receive funding. They'll only receive funding if they prove to investors or potential clients that they have something worth investing in, but they can only develop to that point if they receive funding. So in many ways, governments with like larger budgets or longer timelines or a need that outside of purely financial, maybe a kind of societal return, as Craig mentioned, governments often help in providing another access point for, again, funding most directly and other means. We're seeing this a lot in Europe. It's been all across the world in different projects, but Europe right now, there's a significant amount of that where European governments are, whether it is for their own use and sovereign access and autonomy, or if it's recognizing the same thing that Craig and the UKSA has seen, which is the economic and societal return of space. Basically, governments across the world, and especially in Europe, are recognizing the importance of space and then devoting more funding or more support programs and services. So how does the government support fare in providing value? Again, it can be, in many cases, it can be vital, especially if it's new technologies or new companies. And in other places, it is very important for that company in moving from concept to prototype to actual deployed service.
Thanks, Dallas. And to take a sidestep on this, so as I mentioned off the top, with the UK Space Agency playing such a big role and a leadership role amongst the agency community, are there more types of agencies like the UK Space Agency, or are some taking sort of a reference point here and saying that's a really great model, articulation of value, supporting domestic? Are we seeing more, I like to say generally, UK space agencies in the world?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the U.S. has been one of the strongest funding mechanisms direct from government to commercial players. You know, name a sector. You can look at something as esoteric as the lunar market, where NASA put forward the commercial lunar payload services. So here was a program that was devoted to getting companies involved early on. Very, B2G, business to government kind of model, worked very well. Earth observation, you see a lot of that you saw that in the past with NOAA, a lot of commercial weather pilot programs where if a company could meet certain milestones, they would receive funding, which would help to move certain types of sensor data forward, like radio occultation and such like this. Currently, the U.S., continues to be a large hotbed of activity. Europe, European Space Agency and many specific agencies have been doing this, mostly kind of program by program. Craig, you mentioned about rockets. Those are very interested in development in Europe, a lot of national launch capabilities. But I know we've done some work here in Analysys Mason with some of these agencies, and they're trying to move the space sector forward either through direct funding mechanisms or further commercialization. Other areas, Japan and India, I would say there's a lot of work of building different kind of programs or commercial arms or reallocating funding away from purely internal kind of government programs toward more commercially viable hardware and services.
Okay. Excellent. So there is, again, encouraging, I think, is the word I would use in terms of if I am a space company looking for support, it seems like the universe of public sector support is growing all the time. But we're reaching the end here, but I have another quick question for you, Craig. We didn't talk about much one of the big prevailing, overwhelming trends in space, and we've seen it at events, talking to clients. It's the defense, sort of this big term, defense. And given the current geopolitical environment, does the UK Space Agency play a role in national security development of potentially dual-use technologies? While you're not the Ministry of Defense, still, is this a theme within your purview of companies you support? Is this something that's a prime objective? Because it seems so many governments are trying to, we say the word sovereign all the time, and supporting defense capabilities.
Yeah. There's no escaping the fact that the current geopolitical climate has meant that there's a much sharper kind of defense lens and the national security lens through which, all of government is kind of currently looking. I think it's worth saying that the role of space and space agencies in defense and national security is not a new thing. Historically, perhaps what we've seen is more of a kind of a gap between the kind of civilian agencies and the defense community. And that has perhaps led to a lack of efficiency in the way in which some of our space investments have been made in the past, where, yes, it's true that a lot of the developments that we've made on the civilian side have found their way into the defense community and vice versa, but it hasn't really been done with an overarching combined strategy between the defense and the civilian community. And I think that's the key thing that's shifting and has been shifting over a number of years. So when you look at our most recent kind of publications in the UK, particularly the most recent, the National Space Strategy and subsequent documents, you can feel that there is more of a defense flavor in those documents than previously. Certainly the policy and strategy work that's happened over the last 5 years or so has been trying to better streamline the development of technologies on the civil side such that it also benefits the defense side. It means that we only have to pay once for the right developments instead of paying multiple times. And I would say most recently, kind of more consistent and coherent one government approach to space is emerging in the UK, where we are working much better across different government departments, not just through a defense lens, but also the other government departments that will be ultimately end users of space technologies and space services, so that we see that better coordination. On the defense side, I think it's somewhat inevitable as we look to maximize our investments and spend such that we ensure that our money goes as far as it can and results in the best return on investment, both from an economic perspective, but also from a safety perspective as well.
Excellent. So that's another, again, positive trend, positive momentum, not being so siloed between this, I say, dual use, and kind of the benefits of doing both really are becoming much more inherent in the technology in the market. So, okay, we've reached the end, Craig. I want to thank you and Dallas both. Very interesting topic, interesting sort of podcast on a topic that covers pretty much most of space. Without it, we wouldn't have where we are today. So, Craig, thank you for your input as well. And Dallas, thank you both, gentlemen. If you have questions on this topic, you'll see within the links of the podcast, definitely get in contact with us. We've advised quite a few companies, and Dallas has led specifically on private sector companies obtaining government support. So come to us. We can walk you through what we've done and observed there. And with that ends the podcast. There is more content on this topic on the Analysys Mason website. Within all of our space programs, we cover the government generally and support for space. So by all means, get in touch. And to automatically receive future episodes, please subscribe to the Analysys Mason podcast. Thank you for listening.